Okay, so welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us. I will pass on to Kathy Morrow to introduce Kate McIntosh.
Thank you. Well, Kate is someone I only came aware of a few months ago, but she has had a very interesting career and a very worthwhile one. I've been extremely impressed. She's became an architect in about 1960, born in Edinburgh and brought up there and studied there. And then she was given a scholarship to the Warsaw Polytechnic in what date was that? That was in 1961, where there had been a kind of cultural renaissance going on, and she was very interested to see what was happening and take part and so on. And that must have been an interesting time to be there. And then she cleverly did a sort of series of work schedules in various Scandinavian countries, in Sweden, of course, and in Denmark, and in Finland, where modern architecture had very much taken hold and had a very interesting history. So she absorbed all that. And then she came back to England, where she got a job with the Southwark Council. And still in her 20s, she designed a huge apartment block called Dawson Heights on a hill, very awkward site, and to great acclaim. That building, I went to look at it. It is very interesting. Tower and the windows sort of in the flats, articulated so that no one's view is obstructed, and that's the first job she did, for which she became very well known. And after that, she worked for the London Borough of Lambeth, also interested in modernism, designing a sheltered accommodation in finished in 72, and that building has recently been listed as grade 2, so she has done very well indeed. And then after that she started working in for various councils in around London, in East Sussex and in Hampshire, designing government buildings there, or state buildings there. And she teamed up with her partner, George Finch, also an architect, and formed their own architectural practice for some years. And has, so I'm very interested to see her wonderful pictures and hear the stories of how they came about. Thank you, Kate.
Thank you very much, Kathy, for that introduction. Right, I'll try and flip myself back to early days. The mindset of my generation of architects, which grew up during World War II, was framed in the context of the Beveridge Report, which was the foundation of the welfare state, established when the UK was virtually bankrupt. This identified the 5 giant evils of want, squalor, ignorance, idleness, and disease. First slide, 1964, when les Trente Glorieuses, as the French have dubbed it, were at that zenith. That was the 30 years post-war era, when there was a consensus which held across Europe and beyond that governments have a duty to ensure the provision of the 3 necessities for a decent life, namely secure shelter, education, and healthcare for all. And I would say that without shelter, any investment in education and healthcare will be wasted. You can see on this slide that 1964-65 was indeed the zenith of public housing production. This ethos attracted nearly 50% of our profession of architects to work in the public sector. That has now shrunk to roughly 7%.
Mm. Mm.
All of this framework of progressive protection has been picked apart since 1979 and the introduction of right to buy. 4 out of 10 houses sold under that heavily subsidized scheme are now owned by buy-to-let landlords, with tenants paying more than twice as much in rent. We have become a nation of rentiers, a housing market with a subsidiary economy attached. Next slide, please. These two images are prepared by the Local Government Association in a financial report, and it's in their endeavour to trace what is happening to local government funding over the decade from 2010 to 2020, where, as you see, local government has suffered an average of a 60p cut for every pound of core funding provided for local services. But this withdrawal of funding is not even, but visited most harshly on the areas most in need, as you see on the map, in the map on the right. So the theory in central government is that as their funding is withdrawn, so the business rate will be increased and will make up the shortfall. And that may work in areas like Winchester and Blackheath, which are fairly affluent, but it certainly won't work in the post-industrial north. But in 1964, all of that regression was not imaginable. Next slide. To the young and optimistic, of whom I was one. After a stimulating year as the most junior member of the National Theatre team in Dennis Laston's office, I considered it time to get myself more responsibility and practical experience. And the London boroughs were newly empowered with prime responsibility for housing by the Macmillan government and were under immense pressure to meet housing targets. So when I joined the London Borough of Southwark in 1965, I was presented with this very interesting site, Dawson's Hill, as it was then known, located near Dulwich, and so one of a series of hills which rise to a distance of about 4 miles from the south bank of the Thames. It has stunning views over the city and the former docklands. Now, of course, it's the towers of the banks and dealing houses. And to the south, across Crystal Palace, and to the North Downs and the Surrey Weald. And I wanted to exploit this rare advantage to the maximum. Another major driver of the design was the extremely unstable ground conditions, which meant that the foundations had to be very deep and expensive piling. Next slide. I should mention here that the black and white slides that I'm about to show, the photographer, I would like to give a credit to Robert Kirkman, who is, I believe, one of your members and maybe in the audience tonight. And I met him first in Laston's office. So hi, Bob, if you're there. My solution was a pair of interlocking stepped ziggurats, varying in height from 12 to 3 stories, and the tail of each turning to enclose a communal, car-free open space, safe and well supervised by overlooking dwellings, though open for the enjoyment of the surrounding community. A critique was gaining traction within the profession and beyond at this time of the what was perceived as visual anonymity of many of the large housing developments which had come out of the LCC. And the feeling developed that we wanted to express the separate family dwelling within a unified totality. The scheme I particularly admired was Lydington Gardens on Vauxhall Bridge Road by Darbourne and Dark, dating from 61, and Keeling House in Bethnal Green, designed by Lansdowne, was probably the first to reflect this new style of thinking. That was completed in 57. And so that was one of my objectives in the design, was to heavily model the mass, the large mass of these this conglomerate, so that a child standing in this open space would be able to identify where they lived and point it out to a friend and say, that is my home. The reduction in scale towards the extremities and the staggering of the high points defers to the surrounding scale and minimizes the blocking of sun and view. Next slide. The bridges I put in, linking the high points of each of the ziggurats with the 90-degree flipped tail of the sister block, were for two purposes. One was to give every resident, wherever they were coming from, the shortest possible route to a lift if they were carrying a heavy load or had a pushchair, but also to increase the sense of enclosure within the central space. Next slide. I organized the varying maisonettes so that 3 different sizes shared a common access way, the access way occurring every 3rd floor, so that a 1-bedroom, a 2-bedroom and a 3-bedroom all come off the same access way, and the green in this diagrammatic elevation that you see here, that is the 4-bedroom. So the largest dwellings of all, they come off the lowest access way. And this was to do with the theory that as family sizes vary, so their capacities and needs tend to dovetail, and that hopefully good neighbourly relations would build up. And by having the access ways every 3rd floor, that intensifies the use of that access way and makes it more likely that people will meet each other by chance. The parking is tucked away half a level down from the lowest habitable area and to the north, but not within the central enclosed space, external space. And all of the dwellings are to Parker Morris standard. Next slide. And the space standards, which were established under the Macmillan government and voluntarily adopted by all the boroughs before they became mandatory, and they were scrapped by Thatcher when she came to power, in deference, no doubt, to the interests of the volume house builders who contribute to Conservative funds. And her housing advisor, Alice Coleman, had a very negative attitude towards the sort of spaces that architects put in to try and encourage conviviality. And she labeled these as encouraging crime. And after the Dawson's Heights was transferred by Southwark, the local authorities now being very much starved of funds, so it was difficult for them to properly maintain their properties, whereas the housing associations were more generously treated. And it was transferred to Southern Housing Group. And I think it was under the influence of Alice Coleman that the bridges were taken out. Next slide. All of the dwellings have their living rooms facing south, except for the flip tails which face either east or west. And all of those living rooms are just half a floor or one half flight above or below their front door. The two play stockades that you see here have now been replaced with more conventional play equipment. But I was rather fond of playing cowboys and Indians in my youth. The central conundrum of housing design, to my view, is the balance between privacy and conviviality. And architects generally try to encourage conviviality, but Aris Coleman wanted it to have everyone behind their own little private picket fence. Next slide. Despite the removal of the bridges, the central space does serve as a hub and a focus, not just for the residents in Dawson's Heights, but I'm told on reliable authority that the families from the surrounding suburban houses, their kids also come here and join in the fun. And so this is subsequent to the removal of the bridges. And you can see here one resident has started to colonize with a ground floor dwelling, colonize the space outside and create a garden which is for the enjoyment of all. And she got a prize for this, which she was very proud to show me. Next slide. And so, as I say, the great goings on occur in this central space, and obviously they had to put a stop to it during the lockdown, but it does serve as a great melting pot for the diverse community, the diverse tenures and also ethnicities. So you can see fun and games are going on here. Next slide. I have attended a couple of these together with my granddaughter, who was very fond of enjoying the bouncy castles. Next slide. Now, one good thing that Southern Housing Group did, not the only one, but was they redesignated the lower slope, which was generally agreed to be economically completely unbuildable, so grossly unstable were the conditions, as a public open space and nature reserve, so that school parties can go there and look at the caterpillars and chrysalises and birds and bees and all that. And also it's a great place to get a panoramic view over London, which people gather there, especially November the 5th or any other occasion when there's going to be fireworks over the Thames. So next slide. In 1969, I moved to Lambeth, where I was given a brief for a very much smaller scheme, but it's sheltered housing, which at that time was regarded as the cutting edge latest thinking in the best way to accommodate people in their twilight years. And this is 44 dwellings on a site which had been the garden of a fairly substantial Edwardian villa and therefore was well treed. It's not too far from Streatham Common. I determined that I was going to avoid, if at all possible, all sense of it being an institution. So I split up the accommodation into these cluster blocks, which you see here on the axonometric. And there are 8 flats in each of those blocks, each of the identical 5 blocks or near identical blocks. And the orientation of this is north up the sheet, so that it's orientated east-west. and on the road frontage, which is very narrow, you've got a common room, a warden's flat at first floor level, a guest suite, a communal laundry, and also I persuaded the housing manager to introduce a mini supermarkets, both as a convenience for the residents and as somewhere where they could have some contact with the surrounding community. This was to be the first metricated scheme for Lambeth. All the public offices were obliged to produce a metric scheme at that time, and in preparation for going into the EU. It was to be modular coordinated. Post the collapse of Ronan Point in 1968, the government developed this idea of obliging local authorities to produce what they call a modular coordinated scheme, which was basically meant you had to design on a 300 by 300 grid. And to achieve this, I selected this walling material of dense masonry concrete blocks by Forticrete, next slide, which are 400 by 200 by 100, which provides quite a substantial type of aesthetic. And it was written into the contract that there must be no site cutting of blocks. There are special blocks, which some of which are standard and some were non-standard, but they were no site cutting. So sill blocks and lintel blocks and corner blocks and so forth. And that was a design discipline that I accepted. The pavilions are linked by a covered way. And this is not a completely linear covered way. It does a joggle at the intersection with the entrances to the blocks, at which point it doubles in width. Next slide. The idea being that this would provide a more generous space where a resident leaving or entering their block, if they had a chance meeting with a neighbour, they could linger and have a chat without impeding the flow of other residents who might be passing by. And once again, this a desire to encourage conviviality. Next slide. This is a communal staircase, typical for each block. And that staircase is naturally lit with ley lights to north and south. And the threshold condition is slightly more generous than the minimal, so that people have an option to personalize it somewhat. Next slide. The dwellings were in a proportion of 3 to 1 of 2-person and 1-person dwellings, which allowed me to do these setbacks at first floor level, providing quite generous roof terraces for the first floor dwellings. And the ground floor, there are also setbacks which provide semi-private outdoor spaces for the residents. As you see here, the quite Arcadian nature of the site, and I set out these blocks from the trees to ensure that not a single tree had to be taken down. Next slide. Here you see that these private and semi-private open spaces are well appreciated and well used. Now, when I left for the counties in 1960, 72 or thereabouts, I rather lost contact with my London work. But in 2013, I was contacted by the daughter of one of the residents asking for my advice because her mother and all the other residents had received a letter from Lambeth warning them of their intention to reaccommodate all the residents. They knew not where, and certainly there was no guarantee they would be kept together, because Lambeth wanted to demolish all these buildings and sell off the site. And the residents were very resistant to this proposal, as they liked living there, which obviously was very gratifying for me to hear. She asked me what course of action they could take to resist this. So I advised her that the best thing was to go for listing. So with the help of Docomomo, which you may know is an international organization concerned with the conservation of modern movement buildings, and they actually drafted the listing application. And next slide. In 2015, I must admit, to my surprise and general delight, we were notified that the listing had come through, listing grade 2. And one of the residents who'd been particularly active in bringing this about is the lady you see on the right here with the spectacles. She proposed that the group of buildings should be renamed McIntosh Court, which was, of course, very flattering to my ego. So here we are having a celebration for these events. And especially we had cause for celebration, we thought, because Lambeth, we also learned, had decided to vote 1.5 million to try and get ahead of the systematic neglect that they'd been imposed on these buildings over 40 plus years. So we thought we could relax a bit. They, in the interim, they did consult me on various points, and they totally failed to take any of my suggestions on board. Then in 2018, I was contacted by another resident saying, Kate, you must come down, shoddy work going on. So I hastened down there, next slide please. And what was my horror and astonishment to see this sort of thing going on. Pretty much everything you see here is illegal. It's in contravention of the listing protection. However, there is a legal anomaly with regard to listed buildings. If this were listed grade 1, Historic England could intervene. But the expectation is that in the case of grade 2 buildings, the conservation officer in the planning authority concerned will intervene and serve a repairs notice. But if in a case like this, where the owner of the listed building and the perpetrator of the abuse is the very authority in which the conservation officer is employed, the likelihood of that happening is rather slim. And so it has proved to be. So we are now 3 public apologies, one of which was on BBC London News, 2 expert reports, later, and 2 years after they issued a practical completion certificate, no effective action whatever has been taken to remedy matters. In fact, if anything, matters have got worse. A group of residents are suing Lambeth with the help of an altruistic legal firm, but given the backlog of cases coming or not coming into courts, they're going to arbitration this Friday, so wish them luck. But Lambeth Council are now as eager as is central government to erase the legacy of the Beveridge post-war dispensation. There are 6 estates in line of fire for demolition, including Central Hill by Rosemary Schoenstedt, which I'll come on to later. Lambeth is an extreme example of a culture of asset stripping, in common with many public bodies under the doctrine of shrink the state. The history of this vandalism inflicted on listed buildings, next slide, reflects in a microcosm what is going on in all the property hotspots, in conformity with the advice given by Lord Adonis that the property developers should look at the largest land holdings in London owned by local authorities. Since 1979, 50% of public land holdings have been privatized under the doctrine of shrink the state. All public bodies, from the Forestry Commission through the Ministry of Defence, the National Health Service, and of course local government, have been obliged to prepare yearly audits of their land and property, together with justification for their requiring those land holdings. Naturally, as austerity has bitten, local authorities have been compelled to shed staff and activities, and therefore it can appear that their property holdings are excessive to requirement. The canard that the policy objective is to solve the housing crisis is shown on this graph to be a transparent lie. The yellow line that you see here, that is the production of social housing. That's where the real need is. And the purple line, that is housing benefit spend paid out to private landlords. State-sponsored gentrification masquerading under the slogan of regeneration, as applied to estates within London, has resulted in a net loss of 27% of homes for social rent, despite increases in overall density. No requirement to justify need is placed on the private sector, where it is almost impossible to discover who owns what, as purchases are frequently made through companies registered in tax havens, and land banking is rampant. This corporate capture of public land is a form of legalized larceny. Next slide. In my view. The reason the corporate world is so keen to invest in land is illustrated on this slide. The graph shows on the top line the value of land rising exponentially, and below that are dwellings, other buildings and structures and other forms of wealth. So they don't actually need to build, they just sit on their land holdings and their wealth increases. A select committee report published last year notes the value of land in the UK, according to 2016 data, represents 51% of our national net worth. That is twice that in Germany, and significantly greater than the G7 average, which is 39%. This is not an unintentional side effect, but a central and deliberate consequence of government policies, whereby secure shelter has become not a citizen's right, but the central core function of life's endeavour, binding the individual into the mantra of the marketization of all things. Precarity penetrates well into the formerly secure middle classes and has moved down the generations, ensuring, they hope, a more docile, malleable population, acceptant of further erosions of democratic rights previously assumed as secure. Next slide. The theory that flooding the market with housing will result in improved affordability is absurd, as is demonstrated on this slide, which you see for the second time. The volume house builders have a vested interest in scarcity, which produces inflation. Over the last 5 years, an average of 21,435 per annum of social houses have been sold, each carrying an average public subsidy of £60,370. That's coming out of the public exchequer. 4 out of 10 houses sold under right to buy, as I previously mentioned, are now owned by buy-to-let landlords, and 9.3 billion per annum is paid out to those private landlords in housing benefit. Next slide. This shows the top line here. It's a bit out of date. This has probably got worse since then. That is the UK housing benefit. The bottom line here, the green, that's Germany. Germany has taken some control over the rents which are chargeable within the private letting sector. And in between, you've got Sweden, Netherlands, Denmark, and France. So you can see that we're way, way above the average. And so if all the countries of Europe, we shell out the highest proportion of GDP in housing benefit. And but this is still inadequate for those greedy landlords. And so we have 130,000 children in UK growing up in temporary lodgings, and an exponential rise in homelessness and deaths on our streets. In Scotland, where right to buy was scrapped in 2016, since 2017, the rights of the private residential tenants has been protected, with an end to fixed term rentals, meaning leases are effectively open-ended, and rent increases can only be made once every 12 months. And even then, the tenant who believes the rise suggested is unfair can take their case to a rent officer. No wonder they're looking to shake off the dominance of Westminster. In 2019, research by the Joseph Rowntree Foundation found poverty levels in Scotland to be significantly lower compared to the rest of the UK, due to lower housing costs, and particularly so in the social rented sector. Under Scottish law, local authorities are enabled to levy double council tax on properties left vacant in excess of 6 months. And this generates a very large source of income for local authorities. Next slide. One of the likely casualties of Lambeth's conversion to the neoliberal dogma, Lambeth, of course, is Labour controlled, supposedly, is the Central Hill estate designed by Rosemary Schoenstedt, a pioneering woman architect, during the Ted Hollenby years of tenure. It is roughly contemporaneous with Dawson's Heights, is also on a hill with very unstable ground conditions, and has suffered from 40 plus years of inadequate maintenance, and latterly from the dumping of families on short-term lets with no security of tenure. And there are now at least a fifth of the 374 dwellings left empty, which of course leads to infestation. And here I should mention that another driver of this mania for site clearance and rebuild is the very selective application of VAT which is 20% on retrofit, which weights the market strongly towards site clearance, since new build housing is exempt from VAT. 20% is a huge incentive.
Yeah.
And this is quite contrary to what is needed to reduce emissions and to meet our commitments under the Paris Accord. An application for listing of Central Hill was refused in 2016, but another, which is attracting, next slide, many letters of support, has recently been submitted in the hope of frustrating Lambeth's plan to demolish this wonderful pioneering scheme completed in the early 70s. Next slide. Another current target of Homes for Lambeth, which is Lambeth's arm's length development company, is the demolition of International House, a 12-story little, originally an office tower, which is an integral part of the Brixton Recreation Centre, designed by my late partner, George Finch. The recreation centre in total was scheduled for demolition by Lambeth, only saved by being listed Grade 2 in November 2016. Next slide. Regrettably, the listing excluded the office tower, which is let out by Lambeth on a short-term basis to young startup businesses. Following Sadiq Khan's calling in of the 20-story condo tower proposed on the nearby railway site, one can only conclude that Lambeth hope that a tower of similar height to that 20-story, which was refused, might be accepted on the site of International House. Next slide. Here you see how very integral that fairly small tower is. It's got a roof garden at the top, which is where they have a canteen for the young startups using the tower, and some of them are architects actually. So where to look for hope in London? Next slide. The developments of Peter Barber Associates and his proposals for the densification of London's outer suburbs. These I very much admire, and they're green shoots. One of his associates, Alice Brownfield, won the MJ Long Prize this spring, and in her presentation she talked about two schemes, one of which was Kiln Place, commissioned by Camden and this one is in Camden, commissioned through an arm's length development company to avoid right to buy. There are 15 new homes, 7 of which are proper social rent and required to remain so in perpetuity, as stated in the planning conditions, and 8 are for market sale to help the council retrospectively fund the new homes and wider estate improvements. And Camden retain the freehold, so eventually the land will return to them. Next slide. The other scheme that, these show some of the site improvements, the new access way through and the improved landscape in a courtyard beyond. Next slide. The other scheme that she showed was very close by to yourselves, and you may know it. It's a Greenwich project in Rochester Way on a leftover scrap of land. It's 29 new homes, all are affordable rent, retained in ownership by the council. And some of these rent levels are closer to traditional social rent, which is really good news. There's a small pub, next slide please, and shop and community space on the corner. I think that's it there, which is available for rent by the residents and people in the local community as well. Next slide. And finally, I would like to celebrate the Pritzker Prize winner this year of Lacaton and Vassal, as their award celebrates the re-evaluation of the importance of maintaining, adapting and upgrading existing structures and avoiding the huge waste of sending embodied energy to landfill and the human pain of forcibly relocating people. Grand Parc Bordeaux, which comprises 530 units, has been transformed, all social housing, without moving out any of the residents. Next slide. If this approach had been the norm in UK before 2011, when Lend-Lease started their demolition of Haygate and later of Aylesbury Road, they might still be standing, and their populations would not have suffered the compulsory displacement following the loss of 2,063 socially rented dwellings. Meanwhile, an estimated 22,500 London dwellings stand empty, serving only as deposit boxes for the hyper-rich. The borough with the greatest number of these buy-to-leave investments is Kensington and Chelsea, where stands the burnt-out ruin of the Grenfell Tower, a grim reminder of the consequences of deregulation and the marketization of everything. That's my conclusion.
Kate, that was absolutely marvelous. Thank you so much. I mean, we're very aware of the dreadful things that are happening in London as regards architecture and the corporate grab of land and so on. And you have really, really told us in some detail of the horrible effects of it. I was very interested when you mentioned Peter Barber. We had him come to speak to us once, and admired his work extremely. And it's nice to know there are young architects like that involved in improving things, though perhaps not enough. I mean, the damage is huge. I hope we can overcome it sometime. And you are certainly, your early work, I hope, will continue. I was worried about Dawson Heights, because I think you said there were some problems there with the council, though they're involved in some method of restoration, aren't they, at the moment?
The Housing Association is about to commence a large maintenance of the scheme, which is to be applauded. But I've been trying to intervene. Of course, I have no locus really in this at all, but some of the residents have got some appreciation of architecture. Well, all of them obviously like living there, or they wouldn't still be there. But one of the things I'm distressed about is they're proposing to put a handrail round the roofs which don't already have a normal height parapet, handrail height parapet, rather than just the security anchors, which most people regard as adequate. And the only reason that anyone would need to get up on that roof without erecting a scaffold, which obviously is needed if you're going to do a complete re-roofing, is to attend to the extract fans, which are all in a central position. So I'm trying to persuade them to draw the handrails back from the edge of the roof, so they'll be less visible, because the silhouette, the profile of Dawson's Heights is so very, very visible over a very large, many viewpoints in London.
Indeed. Oh, yes, that's very interesting. Thank you. Thank you. I'll hand over now to Emily, and want to thank you very much for your excellent talk and inspiring talk.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. It really was inspiring, depressing, but also somehow very inspiring as well. So thank you. Are there any questions? People can either use the raise their hand function if they would like to speak their question, or they can type into the Q&A at the bottom. So, okay, here we go. So Susan's raised her hand. Hi, Susan.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kate. Really loved hearing about it, although it was a salutary lesson in what's going and has gone wrong. I wanted to ask your opinion on the Kidbrooke estate. Are you aware of that, the Berkeley Homes development?
I don't vividly call it to mind. It's just a vague sort of worry at the back of my mind. I have heard that there's some dispute going on there.
Well, no, it's just that it's on the site of the
former Bonamy, isn't it?
Former.
What's it called?
No, not, I can't remember. It'll come to me in a minute. But it's done by Berkeley Homes, and it's a mix of social and private. And on the face of it, I haven't seen an analysis, but it looks remarkably successful. There are a couple of tower blocks which are questionable, but in the main, the landscaping and the planning really look like they should be applauded. So I would be very interested to have someone like yourself and your view on that. However, the same part. So the second question, if I may, is we were looking at your figures on, and you said Germany has taken hold of the rental to hold it low. So our question would be, how is it that Germany manages to provide social housing presumably adequately if they're reducing their income on by keeping rents low?
Well, it's not the government which is reducing its income, it's the landlords. The proportion of housing in Germany which was ever publicly provided was lower than this country. This country was really a front runner in that, but it has not inhibited the incentives that the private house providers find they have to build for rent, this is all from what I read in documentation on the web and so on. But in this obsession with home ownership is a peculiarly British thing. The other continental countries, including Scandinavia, hasn't been a class stigma attached to renting in the same way. Of course, it's increased as with right to buy. The residualization is the least desirable housing, is that which no one has bought. And so the Conservatives have always had that attitude that social housing should be housing of last resort. But of course, it has considerable advantages if you have confidence that you have security of tenure and that your rents are not going to be out of control in mobility of labour, for instance, which post Second World War was extremely important for the revitalization of their economy in Germany. Another thing that I should mention is that in Europe, on average, about a third of housing is produced through cooperatives. And especially in Scandinavia, that has been a very popular way to provide housing over a very long period. It's a 100 years tradition. In those countries, building societies are what it says on the tin, they build. So it's a form of, for your average citizen, a form of saving in order to gradually own a house. And one of the advantages of the cooperative system is, as practiced in Sweden, for instance, is that if the householder, the family, they have certain building skills, they can choose the degree of finish at which the building is handed over to them. So a plasterer, for instance, might say, well, I'll do all the plastering, or obviously it would have to comply with whatever the planning consent required as to external appearance. So in this country, there is a suppressed demand for cooperative housing, but the problem is you can't get the sites. There's this little development in Lewisham, Walter's Way, where they're built on the Walter Siegel principle, which has been very, very popular and long lasting, and also the housing is quite adaptable. And for me, the cooperative form of housing is the ideal balance between the communal provision and the right of the individual family to choose, have a right of choice. But in this country, it's completely, there are very, very few examples.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So we have another question here from Richard, who says, do you have a view of community land trusts as a form of ownership and the creation of social housing?
Yes, I'm very much in favour of community land trusts. I think it's an excellent vehicle. If you have to put in quite a lot of time and effort in the administration building up to the realization, but it is a very, very good idea, very good vehicle.
Thank you. Question from Rosemary. She would be interested to hear your views on the current trend of densification housing developments, where tall, densely spaced towers dominate, as around Lewisham Station, and indeed the later phases around Kidbrooke Station. Some of these are justified as being the only way to provide affordable housing. Can you comment on that?
Yes. Well, two comments. One is that it's noticeable that this encroachment on public open space tends only to happen in areas where the population is not too wealthy. You don't see much of it going on in Kensington, Chelsea, or in Westminster. And we all know, especially post-COVID, how desperately important green open space is to our well-being. During the lockdown, I got spontaneous messages coming from the people living at Dawson's Heights, thanking me for the surroundings of trees and verdure and so on, saying they didn't feel they were imprisoned. Secondly, there's been quite a detailed scientific study done by a woman engineer in Arups, I'm afraid I can't remember her name, which demonstrates that buildings of up to 10 stories, you can achieve the same density with a perimeter traditional city block as you can with very tall towers. But the cost in carbon emissions is half, because when you build very, very tall towers, you can't rely on openable windows because of gale force winds. So you're into air conditioning in many cases. Plus, of course, the structural requirements are very much greater when you get up 20 stories and above as compared with 10 stories. So those are my misgivings about densification.
Thank you. Are there any more final questions or comments from anyone? So perhaps, oh, sorry, I'm just seeing if I've got a hand up. No. So perhaps, Kathy, if you have anything else to say, or Kate, if you'd like to say anything.
Just it was extremely good talk, and I thought to remind us of what is actually happening is really, really important. We must try and well, as much as we can to thwart it and move some away from it. I mean, it's so interesting, the contrast after the Second World War, when there was tremendous housing problems and tremendous thing, and they just got on with it and did it properly. You were very fortunate, Kate, to be an architect at that moment, and I think we are fortunate to have heard you today. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I do count my blessings, actually. I completely agree with you that I was fortunate to live in a golden age. I really do think that.
Yes.
Great, thank you. And Joan Ruddock just wanted to say something. Sorry, she did have a hand up.
Hi, everybody. I'm Joan Ruddock, and I'm chair of the Friends of Blackheath Halls. And I just wanted to say, first of all, to Kathy, thank you very much, because the architecture group, which is a subgroup of the Friends, hasn't been able to do very much over the past 18 months. We're absolutely thrilled to have you back. And this is just a terrific discussion this evening. As everyone says, you know, it's a bit depressing on one hand, but it just gives you the inspiration and the knowledge that things can be done differently, and there are ways of doing that. And so thank you very much, Kate, really, really appreciated. And finally to Emily. Emily's actually on holiday, and she has interrupted her holiday to do the technicalities for.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So Robert Kirkman as well would like to talk. So let's hear from him before we go.
Oh, good.
Hi, Robert.
Right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, good. Hi, Kate.
Hi.
Good to hear from you. And it's an excellent talk. Oh, by the way, thanks for the mention. A beef of mine, really, in Lewisham, with these blocks, these tall blocks which are going up. They are abysmal.
I think I may have broken up with the difficulties of my internet here. Okay.
Oh, right. Can you hear me at all? No?
I can hear you.
Oh, you can. It's just that these, they're still putting up these rather bland blocks, 30 odd stories. The the planning there is terrible with the traffic and so on. And this whole business, I mean, just quite locally, there was an attempt to purchase some houses. They're rather fine houses that go from near Blackheath village right down to Lewisham a few years ago, with the intention, of course, of building blocks on that site. And it took quite a fight, really, to fight off the developer. Eventually, a crowd of us managed to do just that. Led by Sir Ian Mills at the time. It's going on all the damn time. I don't know. Well, you said it all really in your talk. You researched it and done it extremely well. Anyway, it's nice, as I said, nice to hear from you again, Kate, after all those years.
Lovely to hear from you, Rob.
And I'll have to give you a chat on the phone sometime, and nice to see you.
Yeah.
I'll end it there, saying bye for now. That was really good.
Bye. Oh, just a word of warning before we wrap up, that you would think that after Grenfell, there might be some reflection that this endless drive to remove all constraints on developers and just go for the commercial option, that this had died the death, but not a bit of it. The Johnson has appealed to all the members of his cabinet to come up with ideas for further deregulation. There is not a regulation that wasn't devised as a consequence of some danger or disaster. It's not to say they shouldn't be looked at again every now and then, but the idea, this is not a considered matter. This is doctrinaire. It's completely driven by irrational doctrine. The business knows best. Business does not know best.
Certainly doesn't. Certainly does not. Okay.
No.
Great. Well, thank you so much. Let's leave it there. Thank you so much for letting us record this as well, because it means that we can be sharing it widely, which I will certainly be doing. Yes, so thank you so much, Kate. Thank
My
you.
pleasure.
Yes.
And good to see you all.
Yes, thank you very much. Good night, everyone.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Good night. Bye-bye.